By any means necessary, on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're having our weekly edition of the Redspin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Nate Wallace, co-host of the Redspin Sports Podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, how's it going? Glad to be back.
Well, we're glad to have you back, Nate. And I think this week we'll begin by touching on some developments in college sports. First, having a look at basketball. It's being reported that more than 1 out of every 4 coaches in a survey said that conference tournaments should not be held this season. And out of the 32 Division I conferences in college basketball, 31 are playing this season. And at least as of today, all of them plan to hold league tournaments. And the question is, should they happen? Will they happen? Things like this. And I was looking at this at a piece on CBS Sports, and they actually quoted an unnamed coach who said that, on the one hand, he never really understood conference tournaments. He said, quote, "After beating the living you-know-what out of each other for 2.5 months, I get why it's done, money." And, he was he went on to talk about the issue of television contracts and things like that, and about how it really doesn't make sense in the way of, trying to have a normal basketball season and what he called an abnormal year, of course, with the coronavirus and all of that. And I'm just wondering how you're seeing that issue, Nate, playing out here in the basketball college issue as, things seemingly continue to steamroll forward despite the pandemic conditions.
Right. So there's a lot in play here. We've had a heavy focus on college football, and it's like, but college basketball, I think as a result of that, we've missed some things that are important. And we had Jeff Capel from the University of Pittsburgh, who actually played at Duke. His younger brother, Jason, played at North Carolina, actually coming out as a head coach, making some statements in December that are as pro players any college coach you'll see about, like, what are we really doing? Even Coach K at Duke, of all people, who's a known Republican, longtime kind of conservative coach, saying things such as that, are we really doing this? Are we doing this the right way? Is this the best use of resources we could be using right now? But what you really realize, though, is ultimately the question that everyone's trying to avoid, trying to deflect, is the reality. What will happen to the NCAA if they have to cancel another year of March Madness, which is why they've developed this Indianapolis bubble concept of having all the teams come there to ensure they can get them in, keep them kind of sequestered during March Madness to make sure it goes on as planned, and that they are able to get the money from, that they have from, for this, from CBS for the broadcast of the tournament. They rely on that heavily. So there's, it's clear that that's really a huge part of this. Conversely, the conferences have these tournaments that a lot of times really are kind of ridiculous. I think they're enjoyable on a personal level to see all the teams come together to have a tournament. The Big East tournament in New York City has always been a big deal at Madison Square Garden. But the reality is they've become sort of with the NCAA tournament expanding, more teams getting in, sort of like just a kind of an exhibition and really just a chance for conferences to make a lot of money off the TV deals. So what you have going on here is you have Frank Martin at the University of South Carolina, who's actually been known as a hardcore disciplinarian, the son of the Cuban exiles and stuff. But he has contracted coronavirus twice. And he's talking very candidly about the fact that these conference tournaments, like, first of all, in a season like this, why not use that time to try to make up games? Why bring everybody to a neutral site together there and then potentially compromise the ability to even have their bubble NCAA tournament? And the reality is, I think it needs to be pointed out that the NCAA they had insurance on it last year. I don't think they get any insurance if this happens again. And what if you have these conference tournaments result in, because it's not just on-court transmission. I mean, the data shows it's not so much that COVID gets transferred while they're playing. It's like more the meals and the walking around and being, and the kind of social engagements. I guess when you're playing, you're moving so quickly. I mean, it can't happen, but that's not the main transmission method. So it's really striking the fact that they're pushing for it. They're not even listening. You think of 27% of coaches are saying this now. I mean, these are guys that have been conditioned to think we got to push on. We want to always be here trying to say stuff like our players want to play. We're just doing what they they want and all this and trying to frame it as player choice, there's something really amok. And it really is about these conferences trying to ensure they get their TV money. And Corona be damned, even if it affects the NCAA tournament, be damned, because, you're bringing people unnecessarily together to one place to have a tournament that, in this year particularly, is it really essential? Is any of it essential? No. So it's really obviously, a clear money grab.
And Nate, the issue of the money that different entities make off of these student athletes, off of college and amateur sports has been a feature in an ongoing lawsuit between the former Duke men's basketball star Zion Williamson and some other folks in the prime sports business after he signed with Creative Arts Agency. There's been this ongoing lawsuit between Williamson and these other parties for more than a year. What is this all about, and why is it important in this ongoing discussion that we keep having about the money folks are making off of student athletes and their talent?
It's really important. It goes back to it's a lot of legalese, and I don't want to get into all the little details because this has been going back and forth about whether it should be filed in North Carolina or Florida. The reality is that it shows more than anything else. First of all, the fact that he has to try so hard to conceal, to make sure it's publicly, there's no public record that he accepted any money before he declared for the NBA draft. Somebody who, much like these college football players involved in this scandal now, which you see rocking the University of Tennessee and other schools that are major programs in the country now, about impermissible benefits, never mind you the CARES Act, the HEROES Act, and these oligarchs, this looting national wealth. No, we got to go after student athletes. So it's about Zion Williamson and about the idea of somehow not, that he committed to this other group before he went to CAA, which is affiliated with LeBron James's group, and is, obviously a much better fit for him. And these people just being mad because they feel like that they got left at the altar, really, and they want like a piece of so they're trying to go back. But part of the contradiction, the hard thing with this is that in order to prove that, they have to go back and try to reveal that they were involved in some chicanery and some things they weren't supposed to be doing by recruiting him already while he was a student athlete at Duke, which won't make them look good. But also there's also a situation in North Carolina where there's protections for athletes that from unscrupulous types like this agency that's suing him now, or actually Zion initially it was threatening suit, and then Zion sued first. But they file in Florida purely to avoid that North Carolina law. It gives more protections to athletes against these kind of exploiters that are now trying to claim that, though he didn't fulfill some contract. So it's really just a sham. And, obviously I hope Zion Williamson prevails, and I believe he will.
Yeah, and speaking of recruiting, it seems that the NCAA have had their own sort of spate of recruiting controversies and violations here recently. I was just looking at something around violations against Notre Dame, a historic football powerhouse and things like that. What's going on with these violations, and how do you think that ties in to this broader conversation we're having about college sports and the plight of student athletes?
Sure. So, there's some really kind of wild stuff with this. It goes back to, just cash payments, quite frankly. Dan Patrick on his show talked about the University of Tennessee assistant, and the Tennessee thing kind of spearheaded it. And now coming out that Notre Dame, Florida, other programs have been mixed up and potentially involved in this too. And the recruitment of a student athlete from Garfield High School out in the Seattle, Washington area that was a huge recruit, and it just sort of, this information came out. This kind of stuff goes on all the time. But, an assistant coach from Tennessee football, who Tennessee, mind you, has just fired their coach, Jeremy Pruitt, with cause, just as a BS way of trying to get out of paying him the buyout after they gave him an extension just a few months ago, actually. Now we're trying to get out of it because, make no mistake, if he had won big and helped them win games, they would be trying to find a way to excuse this kind of behavior. And honestly, it's not really that bad behavior. I mean, it's like, yeah, these coaches it's shady and stuff, but why shouldn't they be trying to pay these student athletes, these recruits that like are at the point in their life where they have all these big schools coming after their services? They're young. They're at a point of leverage at that age. Why should they have to be like hiding and doing this stuff in secret? Anyways, these schools should be bidding for their services, essentially, especially in this country where none of these people, these oligarchs, these rulers, these people that we have that creating these problems do anything for free. So that's a sham. But here's the quote from the Tennessee assistant. He says, "You literally have bagmen. They put the cash in McDonald's bags and handed it to the recruits. My source said they were so in your face with this, they weren't even trying to hide it. And that's where my source said Tennessee got sloppy. Georgia has gotten sloppy. But there's been no word on the NCAA looking at Georgia. But Tennessee, they got sloppy, and they were handing out cash in McDonald's bags." So you have a situation where now Tennessee's gotten rid of their head coach. Jeremy Pruitt has brought in another guy to try to, it was ostensibly going to be an assistant, but they really kind of saw the writing on the wall. Then we named interim head coach Kevin Steele, and now they have another scandal on their hands. But why is this really a scandal, I think, is the larger question. And, with Notre Dame, they're involved in the same kind of thing. It might not be McDonald's bags, but the whole bagman, this whole fact that players cannot make money off of themselves, that it's illegal, enables these shady figures, these bagmen, these people that roll around in the shadows and find a way to get a cut of the action themselves for doing it. So it's just fundamentally, as long as this dynamic's in play, we're going to keep having stories like this.
Yeah, I think that's a fact. I think that's a fact. And it's just, to me, just fascinating to sort of see how this dynamic plays out in the ongoing justification around the treatment of student athletes under this concept of amateurism, something that I wasn't familiar with before we began having the Redspin report segment here with you on By Any Means Necessary, Nate. But as ever, I think it's just another example of how capitalist exploitation plays out. But, it wraps itself in frankly, heroics of sports and all these sorts of things and the supposed purity of all of that. Meanwhile, the already rich continue to rake in incredible profits. But be that as it may, we're going to leave it there for now. Nate here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. But we will be back. So please stay with us.
By any means necessary.